I'm saying. Hey, don't touch that shit. Don't touch that shit. Don't touch that. Hello, my dear friends. How is it going? I'm Ari Thurger, and today I'm going to briefly talk about the Cult of Odin in the Viking Age, which I hope to be a video that will aid in better understanding this religious focus of late Iron Age Scandinavia and throughout the Nordic early Middle Ages on future videos, where it will be necessary to have a certain basic notion concerning what we truly know about the cult and rituals around and towards the Old Norse god Odin. If by any chance you are squeamish about the term cult, worry not, no need to be so anxious and start to hyperventilate. I have done a video in the past where I have focused on the differences between religion, cult and ritual. So if you have the time to watch that video, well, do it, if you please. But let us not waste any more time and go straight to the point. Actually, before really jumping into the information about the Cult of Odin as much as it was possible to obtain thus far, I think it is important to underline a few factors concerning this field of study. So bear it with me, please. I'm quite certain you have come about this sort of information before, because I too have read plenty of it. The idea that Odin was the most worshipped god in the Viking Age, and this is indeed an idea we find in several books dedicated to the study of the history of religion in pre-Christian Scandinavia. These are still good sources, mind you, and we still use them today to elaborate our scientific works around these studies. Of course, with new discoveries and a greater and better focus on the literature of the time and an interdisciplinary scientific effort, mainly focusing on archaeological discoveries, we now have a better idea that Odin was really a highly worshipped god, but not the most worshipped. We have to take into account that as the religious thinking of the populations of Northern Europe changed, especially during the Iron Age, we began to see a decrease in the cult of many deities. And in fact, only the most prominent deities in the social space of the Scandinavian aristocracy will have more prominence, ending up absorbing attributes of other deities and other cults towards other deities. We have reached a point where the great pre-Christian pagan cults of Scandinavia will focus mostly on a group of three gods: Freyr, Thor and Odin. For this reason, even when we really have the formation of a literature that focuses on these religious realities, we are already at a very late time, and therefore the literature itself will focus more on the deities that would be more prominent in the social religious space of the elites. So, the god Odin was indeed a very worshipped god at the end of the Scandinavian Iron Age, but a god worshipped by the aristocracy. As I said, there are lots of books, works, essays, studies that will focus on the idea that Odin was the most worshipped god of them all. Such works were mostly written throughout the 20th century, which in turn, for the elaboration of these scientific works, resorted to what were considered the most important sources at the time: the prose Edda and the poetic Edda, the Eddas, right? And indeed, in these sources, the Eddas, the god Odin appears a lot, and other deities as well. But this is precisely where our first problem lies. These are sources that circulated among the elite, which means that these literary sources, the Eddas, the sources of the time, not only focused on the narrative and oral tradition among elite spaces, but they were also produced by the elite. Hence, they focused on a religious reality that was not at all the general reality of pre-Christian Scandinavia. If we only focus on these two literary sources, the Eddas, it becomes quite limiting to try to understand the belief system at this historical period. We cannot forget the various types of cults spread across Scandinavia, the influences of beliefs over time, external influences, and religious and cultural syncretism, such as the mixing of belief systems in border areas, as an example, and the type of beliefs and local folklore at a community level, at the regional and even place level. Not everyone subscribed to the same kind of beliefs. Odin, being a god linked to the elites, to the aristocracy, all kinds of religious understanding and worship around this deity would be something quite restricted to the rest of the population. The literary sources themselves were not available to the vast majority of the population, which in fact focused more on the god Thor. Although there was no pre-Christian Nordic religion, in the sense that there was no official religious organism with specific doctrine and religious literature as an official canon supporting the religion, there were some temples. Indeed, there were. However, such temples were controlled by local elites, usually built by a wealthy lord who presided over religious worship and controlled religious ceremonies and sacrifices. The general population had limited access to the cults of the elites, watching the rituals and ceremonial celebrations of the elites, of the aristocracy. But the general population, in their familiar spaces and in their social spaces, would have many different beliefs, several belief systems, in which Odin would certainly have some weight influenced by the elites that govern the populations, but it would not have the same impact that this same god would have on the aristocratic space, and certainly would not have the same impact as other deities and beings that would be more important for the daily life of the populations, of the general population, the common folk. Nor can we forget the fact of belief personalization, since each person in their own familiar and private spaces would have a very different religious and magical understanding depending on the space where they lived, their profession, and the way they interacted with both their social space and the natural space, and the cognitive developments towards their own perceptive reality. There it is, the non-existence of a fixed and official religion, but rather a vast system of beliefs, mostly of an animistic character. There is greater freedom for the personalization of religious belief. Then there is also the question of the difficult separation between religion and magic. We are dealing with, again, more animistic pre-Christian beliefs. So in most cases, there is no concrete separation between a religious understanding and an understanding of magic, as we see later in the Judeo-Christian doctrine, in which the elites indeed clearly began to formulate a clear separation between what is religious and acceptable and what is magic. But in a pagan context, this separation is difficult to understand. In fact, it is almost non-existent. Because religious practice, rites, rituals, ceremonies, celebrations, and reenactments are part of a very pragmatic elaboration, in which the magic act itself is an act of communication with the gods, with various entities, with the spiritual world and supernatural that would not be defined as a space far and apart from mundane reality, but on the contrary, the reality of other non-human entities would be closer to the human being, a coexistence between social and physical spaces in an animist perspective. Hence, there is a variety of beliefs and cults because there is also a great personalization of religious act, of the act of worship and rite due to the spiritual understanding of each person who acted according to their beliefs and their perception of reality. For this very reason, a cult of a deity would not be something fixed that everyone would do in the same way, in the same manner, but with many variants from place to place and from community to community. Understanding ritual personalization makes all the difference and helps to understand why there is so much different material culture for a single deity, which sometimes seems quite contradictory, because precisely the ritual and cult elaboration would be something very personalized, sometimes only following the same line of thought in the same geographic spaces or social spaces, or following an artistic style as the most appealing for the time period and for the particular religious expression towards a given entity that was imagined in that particular sense. And finally, one of the reasons why it becomes so limiting to understand the worship, cults and rites of pre-Christian Scandinavian deities if we only focus on the prose Edda and the poetic Edda is because these sources focus on myth and not ritual. This is important to keep in mind. Rite is not myth. There is a big difference between ritual and mythology. Mythology is a process of oral tradition that preserves knowledge about many different things within a cultural space that is always moving and always evolving. Mythology is a cultural code that helps to preserve knowledge through mostly phonetic elements that help better and foster association of ideas, and this helps to preserve ideas precisely because of the ease in associating elements that sound familiar. As I understand it, mythology itself is not a ritual. It may contain religious elements and even a cultural understanding of a cognitive understanding of some human practices, but it is not ritual. Ritual is human practice, pragmatic behavior in the face of belief personalization, such as sacrifice as an example. Various types of blot, Old Norse sacrifice, sacrificial rite as a religious action that, through the consecration of something or someone to a deity or another entity, aims to influence it in the direction intended by the offerer, either to establish or to maintain or to restore a satisfactory relationship between it and the human being or group that offers. It is for this reason that Icelandic sagas and historical chronicles have become the primary sources for exploring, understanding and studying rituals. So yes, it is in these sources, which before had not had much focus, that show us some rituals and do not focus so much on the myth. They focus more on human action in relation to the religious and not on the explanation of the religious. As stated earlier, the Eddas show no evidence of ritual to the god Odin. Some Icelandic sagas, historical chronicles, material culture and toponymy are what give us indications of rituals to the god Odin. However, such literary and material sources are not very detailed in relation to the rituals. We only have a few indications, but unfortunately, through them, we do not have enough to make a detailed reconstruction of the rituals and cults of the god Odin, or towards the god Odin, at least so far, according to what has been possible to find and the knowledge that has been obtained thus far. Literature doesn't give us all the details and how the rites were done and the whole process. Archaeology surely has been giving us a lot of information, and we have a notion of the material culture used in the rites, but unfortunately we are dealing with static elements, and therefore the intention and the performance and all the human factor involved is not possible for us to understand. And of course, toponymy, the study of the names of places, we have the notion of the places in which certain deities were more important and there would be a great cult associated with them, hence names of places. derive from such deities. But like archaeology, we are dealing with spaces that do not reveal much about the human factor. Although we have a certain limited perception of the formation of the cognitive landscape, that is, the landscape element, the place, would be conducive to the cult of a deity according to the human perception of the place towards a particular belief system. And therefore, such a deity whose name the name of the place derives from, and this is sometimes a good indicator because an archaeological intervention in these places can reveal material culture that will give us more information. But all of this does not allow us to have a precise detail on what and how the rites were like. But in terms of toponymy, that's where I would like to explore a little bit now. We have several places where we know that there was a greater concentration of Odinic cults. It is even possible to more or less have an idea of the areas. But of course, many of these places were centers of power, centers of commerce, and a great concentration of people and cultures. So it is normal to have a greater concentration of cults in these areas. And precisely because they were centers of power, and taking into account that Odin was a god much more worshipped by the elites, by the Scandinavian aristocracy, obviously in these centers of power will be the god Odin one of the most worshipped, because it was in these places that the elites were positioned and controlled these places. But there are also, of course, names of places that relate to the god Odin, such as areas of forests, fields, rivers, areas and places where, in a way, the natural landscape would be in agreement with the cult of Odin. Very possibly areas of sacrifice to this deity or a major event that took place in that locality that will be associated to Odin, and thus a local area will be named after Odin. I mean, throughout the whole of Scandinavia, we will find place names in relation to Odin, but the real great area of concentration of Odinic cults, that is, the area where it has the largest number of place names in reference to Odin, is the area of Uppland in Sweden, the area between Uppsala and Birka. It is in this area that there is a large concentration of Odinic figures, that is, figures generally associated with Odin, such as the representation of Odin himself, or a human in a performance in the cult of Odin. This type of material culture, which I think it's absolutely fantastic, are figures of warriors, usually carrying spears, but also other weapons such as swords and ritualistic elements such as a helmet with horns, or what appears to be horns but are often representations of birds, possibly of ravens, Odin's ravens. And of course, there is some doubt here whether they are really horns or whether they are representations of the bird's circular movement around Odin's head. Both are plausible. We are not, of course, looking at helmets that would be used in battle, because we already know that in the Viking Age helmets did not have horns, and in fact it is in the Scandinavian Bronze Age that we really see helmets with horns and figures with helmets with horns, which would not be used for combat, but rather not only for ceremony and for an activity of a ritual nature, but also as an indication of a figure of power. For this very reason, these figures of Odin from the Iron Age could actually be helmets with horns, as well as the representation of headdresses for ceremonies and cults related to the Odinic cult. Therefore, not for battle, not for combat, but a performance and the embodiment of the divinity in the human figure for the purpose of the ritual, a ceremonial reenactment. So could be the representation of the circular movement of birds, but could also be horns as well. But the idea here is the use of a type of ceremonial paraphernalia for the purpose of the cult. Nowadays, I have seen some people, some modern age heathens, stating that they are true to the gods and the rituals and they do it as it was done before in the past, and that everybody else is LARPing. Live action roleplay, right? LARPing by dressing in certain ways and pretending to be someone or some figure. But the truth is that our ancestors were very much LARPing in the sense that they would dress in various ways to incorporate the gods and other entities for the purpose of ceremony, ritual, cult, religious performances. Every culture anywhere around the world has done this. And the Scandinavians of the Iron Age were very much LARPing as well for religious and cultic purposes, as it was important to incorporate the deities and other beings which were being evoked for any particular purpose. We still have this all over Europe. The winter costumes to ward off the cold and evil spirits and to praise fertility. Something I'm quite familiar with, as I have dressed as one of these creatures before. And all over Europe we still do this, dressing as something we are not for the purpose of the ritual. As I was saying, the spear is a weapon that is normally associated with the cult of Odin. We find this reference in abundance in the literature referring to the time, and of course many spearheads have also been found in various graves, warrior graves, with the presence of spearheads in contexts that make a direct allusion to the god Odin. However, the spear seems to have been a religious element widely used in religious processions, especially if we consider the number of figures carrying spears that we also find in tapestries of the time. This is what I also want to refer to because, as I said earlier, the god Odin is a god mostly linked to the Scandinavian elite of the Iron Age and Nordic medieval times, Nordic early Middle Ages. And when we are dealing with tapestries, it is a type of material culture belonging to the elite, to the aristocracy. They reflect various realities of the life of the elites, not only daily life, but also religious ceremonies and rituals. Tapestries are a phenomenal work, expensive, valuable, and rare, which would be exposed in the homes and the halls of the lords of the Scandinavian aristocracy of the Viking Age, and therefore express this social reality. We are not dealing with a material culture that would exist in the social space of the general population, but in the semi-private space of the aristocracy, and therefore the tapestries reflect a narrative of the elite itself. So it is in this type of material culture that we see the life of this elite depicted, whether they are aristocracy or even a figure of power, a wealthy warrior or lord, and there is always this relationship with the god Odin. As mentioned in a previous video, this favoritism for Odin from the part of the aristocracy stems from the belief that kings are descended from Odin, legendary kings as well as legendary warrior heroes who trace their descent to Odin. It is a genealogical aspect we often find depicted in the literary sources, in the Volsunga saga, as an example. Odin as god of those who die in battle and go to Valhalla. Odin was not a god linked to any type of warrior, common warrior who died in battle, but god of the dead by violent death, primarily the dead in battle, the warriors of the elite who were the descendants of Odin, meaning the members of the royal families who venerated their own ancestors in Odin himself, or through Odin. Scandinavian aristocracy traced their legendary lineage to the god Odin himself. So this particular belief was very rooted within the aristocracy, and so the material culture within the space of the elite would reflect this devotion to Odin. Hence, we see several allusions to the Odinic cult in tapestries. But there it is. Even so, we don't have any primary sources that tell us exactly what the cult was like, how all the material was used, how the spears were used, why the helmets were worn, the purpose of the rites, of the rites, of the rituals, and where they went, what the final destination was, and what was actually done. We may have the material culture, but we don't have details about the ritual itself. Speculations, assumptions, yes, there are many. Now, detailed and concrete information about reality is not available in abundance, unfortunately. We know from the literature, as an example, that in moments of battle, warriors threw their spears, mostly darts, javelins, towards the enemy and called out to the god Odin. So at certain moments, mainly in battle, we know that this evocation of the deity existed. But speaking of tapestries, I would like to show you one that I think is absolutely outstanding, and that makes an important reference to the cult of Odin, which is the sacrificial element of hanging. Of the numerous names of Odin, many of them allude to hanging, one of his names being God of the Hanged, precisely. An important fragment of this tapestry shows us a scene of apparent human sacrifice or initiation, where 9 males are hanging from a large tree in a grove of serpents. In the lower left corner, there is a representation of a swastika, directly related to this sacrificial motif. I won't go into too many details today about the swastika, because that requires a video solely dedicated to that symbol alone. However, in the Scandinavian context of the late Iron Age, Scandinavian late Iron Age, and even post-Christianization of the 11th century, the swastika is directly related to the god Odin, and we see the swastika in various contexts, such as one of the symbols directly linked to Odin and his representations, as well as other iconography linked to this deity. Hanging from a tree is a motif that occurs a lot in the literature in relation to sacrifices to Odin. Hangings that occurred from the Iron Age until the end of the late Iron Age, the Viking Age. So we are facing an Odinic cult, and in this tapestry that mostly reflects the religion of the elites, we have a strong presence of these hangings, these ritualistic sacrifices of the cult of Odin. Trees where these hanging rituals were performed, and one of the reasons why perhaps some natural spaces have a reference to Odin in the toponymy, because some individuals would be hanged there as sacrifices to Odin. In the case of this tapestry, we have a swastika, as I said, that is once again reminiscent of the cult of Odin in these contexts. So now we jump into bog bodies. Lovely. This is a phenomenon that is very present in the geographical context of what is nowadays Denmark. It's one of those archaeological contexts that I have never had the pleasure of participating in, because, well, we are talking about environments where the lack of oxygen helps to preserve bodies. I have dealt with many burials, but it's always mostly the bones that are preserved, and in a few rare times cremation wasn't as effective as it is today, so also bits of hair as well. But the bog bodies is really another story, and such knowledge to me is purely theoretical, unfortunately. Well, but it is for this same reason, the lack of oxygen, that other elements are also preserved. Perishable materials that would disappear in a normal context, of course, still remain in these contexts. We are talking about the ropes that were used to hang these individuals. Sacrificed by hanging, and then the body was deposited in the swamp, in a bog area. These bodies are preserved naturally. There is no oxidation, and that's why I eat an apple a day when I get up, so as to not be oxidized, and to see if I walk around here longer, because basically with so much work and few hours of sleep, I'm already a preserved body that walks purely by the power of pure spite. What drives me on is to prove the haters wrong. But then, a very interesting aspect of the bog bodies are the marks preserved on the neck from the force of the rope in the hanging process, and also analysis of the stomach of the victims, which present a last meal that is not in accordance with the usual type of food for the time. But yes, a meal with milk, honey, and various cereals like a porridge. And 1,000 years later, we have on TV people eating Kellogg's cornflakes to help lose weight. So it's basically the same thing. A last meal before being sacrificed, most likely to the god Odin, or a slightly earlier version. Of course, there are several bog bodies in different contexts and times and geographical areas, but here we are only talking about those who were clearly hanged, generally with the chronology of the Scandinavian Early Iron Age. Hence, I say that we are possibly facing a sacrifice to a deity that would be an early version of the Odin we will then find later on in the Viking period all over Scandinavia. There is this hanging link that remains in the figure of Odin. And I think the curious part is the deposit of the body in the swamp, in the water. Even today, in many types of European folklore, the element of water exists in a perception of the natural boundary to the underworld. I've already talked about this on this channel in another video, so if you have the time, I suggest you watch this video as an introduction to the element of water related to death. And then 4 more videos focusing precisely on the folklore part. I'll leave them on the screen, on the description, don't worry. But we are facing an early version of sacrifice by hanging towards a deity, and in Odin we will continue to see this pattern of sacrifices. Another aspect I would like to point out is that bands of warriors that are usually associated with the cult of Odin. We see this not only in tapestries, but also in other decorative elements such as helmets and warrior figures carrying spears directly linked to the cult of Odin. Generally, we are talking about war bands that form the levies of kings, wealthy lords, or even chieftains who have enough power and wealth and property to have in their own power a group of armed people. Generally, we are talking about a group of warriors who form the personal guard of someone important, or what is called a levy, a group of people enlisted for military service in a more feudal type of medieval conscription, of course. Once again, we return to a detail in the Osberg tapestry, an Osberg textile fragment which demonstrates a horned figure with crossed spears facing a person wearing bear skin. Once again, we see this pattern of warriors with head dresses that point us to helmets with horns, or a type of decoration that resembles horns but are representations of bird figures. And together with spears and javelins, which we see in other contexts generally related to the cult of Odin. These warriors, in movement and dancing warriors with spears, decorative elements with this pattern, which we also find in an Anglo-Saxon context, which is also very curious. Some defend the hypothesis that the initiation to the cult of this deity begins precisely through a military path, and that, therefore, the warriors would be worshipping Odin within this warlike scenario. However, the truth is that it is still not possible for us to prove that this type of religious initiation actually existed, an initiation to the cult of the god Odin within these aspects and practiced among these bands of warriors. We can be in the presence of specific figures that would embody the divinity, and in ritual ceremony would provoke a certain impact in the group of warriors, a violent fervor as an inspiration due to the presence of the divinity embodied by an individual. It may not be an entire group of warriors within the cult of Odin, but rather just a single individual whose purpose in his performance was to spur the warriors into battle, encourage them to do battle and carry on violence, precisely because of his existence and performance. as an evocation of Odin to exercise his power over the warriors, and then we would have a figure that clearly stands out from the others in material culture and would be there as a ritualistic element incorporating the divinity, as if possessed by the essence of the divinity, which has already been mentioned here many times on other videos. This type of performance was not uncommon in many cultures and their respective religions. This need to communicate with the divine through a human figure whereby the body is used by the divine and the deities speak through the human mouth and express themselves through the human body. It could be one of these or one of those hypotheses. There are some indications of warrior initiations. Of course there are, but this is an open subject yet to be explored and many things to be discovered, so it is still too early to speculate on the matter. Some historical chronicles and even Icelandic sagas mention this type of cult and initiation, but never in a very detailed way. Even for the time, it seems to be speculation based on observation and not on lived experience. But yes, there was clearly the existence of individuals dressed in a more elaborate way, even with the skins of bears and wolves, Berserkir and Hulfredin, who certainly played an important ritualistic role that fits into the cult of Odin. I'm not going to explore much about the Berserkir and the Ulfaldin here on this video today, right now, because I've already made a video just focusing on the study of these figures, and so there's that video for you to watch if you have the time and patience, of course. So we don't have to waste too much time here repeating the same thing. Therefore, certain warriors who worshipped Odin would wear clothing and paraphernalia in accordance with their cult. Not so much a question of everyone that was a warrior or enlisted for military service that would automatically be within an Odinic cult and worship Odin, but rather individuals who worshipped Odin and would demonstrate this social religious aspect through the decorative elements they would use according to the cult. LARPing. Alright, my dear friends, this was a brief introduction to the cult of Odin, which will serve as basis for videos to come, I hope. And I hope you have found this video useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell, my dear friends.